Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here and very grateful to Chris for having me back and to all of you for being here. And also, I have to say that I immensely enjoy the discussions and conversations we have in our class on the politics and erotics of reading. So thank you. This talk, as Chris mentioned, has little to do with the topic that we are discussing in the seminar. And as Chris mentioned, it's extracted from an essay I wrote as a preliminary exploration in view of this show that I'm curating at the Jeu de Paume, which will open on February 10. So, there are so many images, as you know, and their number is so immense that their crowd, or tide, literally verges on the immeasurable. In 2015, social media users shared more than 3 billion images every day. Pictures are ceaselessly produced and circulated in an unheard of amount. So much so that it is difficult to imagine to produce an image of such a plethora of images. How could we picture the overflow of pictures? Eric Kessels created in 2011 an impressive installation, 24 hours in photos. This huge pile of about 350,000 photographs downloaded in the time frame of one day by the Dutch artist certainly evokes the feeling of drowning in representations, as he says in an interview, but it is very far from the real density of an iconic traffic that exceeds 1 million images per hour. I will use the adjective iconic in the first sense mentioned by the Oxford English Dictionary, that is to say, of or pertaining to an icon, image, figure, or representation. Can you imagine? This unceasing flood is nothing compared to the number of images produced that do not end up on social media. In 2000, Kodak announced that consumers around the world had taken 80 billion photos. But these figures have increased exponentially with the dissemination of digital photography. In 2015, according to the market research firm Info Trends, global consumers will take more than 1 trillion digital photos. This limitless foaming or flooding of images might well be even greater than what we hardly imagine, since, as the American artist Trevor Paglen recently suggested, I quote, "Human visual culture has become a special case of vision, an exception to the rule." And he continues, "The overwhelming majority of images are now made by machines for other machines, with humans rarely in the loop," end of quote. Paglen gives a whole list of striking examples, from automatic license plate readers to cameras in malls that track motion and facial expressions, or imaging systems that oversee packaging and logistics. In other times and contexts, these images would no doubt have been called akeiropoietic, that is to say, not made by the hand. It's a Greek word. The adjective akeiropoietos is found, for example, in the New Testament, in Paul's second epistle to the Corinthians, 5:1, I quote, "An eternal house in heaven not built by human hands." And the adjective describes later the imprints or negative images of Christ, like the Shroud of Turin or the Veil of Veronica. In the Gospel of Mark, 14:58, there is an occurrence of the adjective keiropoieton that qualifies the temple as made with human hands. So Trevor Paglen characterizes this growing portion of the visible that escapes the reach of the human sensorium as, I quote him again, an invisible visual culture. Visibility is increasingly managed. It is produced, handled, and harvested unbeknownst to us. The iconic glut, the overabundance of pictures that we are witnessing, or that we can less and less bear witness to, is made possible and is managed by what appears or disappears as a shadow economy. That is to say, a hidden economy. There are, for example, masses of so-called click workers who are offered online jobs by websites like clickworker.com that advertise ideals of freedom and flexibility. These shadow workers, sometimes gathered in click farms that look like assembly lines for the production of visibility, constitute the dark side of the enlightened commerce of artificial intelligence, the cheap labor, an alienated Cairo-poetic labor that feeds and trains the smart robots. In Click Workers, a short minimalist video shot in 2017, French artist Martin Le Chevalier has given a voice to those whose daily and nightly toil contributes to organizing or handling the overflowing fluxes in the image space. While we watch an empty room somewhere, we hear the monotonous voiceover that narrates fragments of semi-fictional autobiographies. I quote some of them. I work 10, 15, 20 hours a day, says Magda from Poland, but I don't even earn what a factory worker earns. I look at porn pictures, decapitations, stuff like that, and I tag them. End of quote. Another woman, Riha from Dhaka in Bangladesh, talks about the small team that she's part of. I quote her in the video. Each of us manages hundreds of accounts, and we do likes. We sell likes by bundles of 1,000. We also do views of videos by thousands. We watch without watching, hours, days, entire lives of videos that we pretend we have seen. End of quote. So this is what goes on the dark side of the management of visibility. But it is also behind the images, beneath, so to speak, their glossy or pixelized surface, that another shadow economy is operating. The economy of what I called in a book entitled The Supermarket of the Visible, the secret writing of their very coming into appearance. In other words, their coding, formatting, and weighing the high or low resolution that makes them lighter or heavier, their indexing, in some, the administration of their coming into sight. But all these aspects of the new iconic economy derive from the capacity of images to circulate. In the end, they pertain to what I suggested to consider as the road networks of the visible, les voiries du visible in French, a notion that I drew from Walter Benjamin's idea of innervation. So images follow roads, itineraries through the visible. Visibility is striated with routes, avenues, dead ends, crossroads, or highways, the study and cartography of which has been sketched out before Benjamin by Aby Warburg. In Warburg's writings, we can see how the idea emerges of a circulatory movement of images that is organized according to a transportation network for the description of which a new lexicon has to be developed. What Warburg calls image migration, Bilderwanderung in German, implies what he calls migratory routes, Wanderstraßen, that have to be mapped as the paths that make iconic exchanges possible. But the mobility of images is also the result of what Warburg calls their vehicles. He sometimes characterizes them as automobile, or what he calls their means of transportation. I have a somewhat long quote by Warburg from the English translation of his introduction to the Atlas Mnemosyne. It was a builder atlas, an atlas of images that he has been working on for a long time and that he left unfinished when he died. I will go back to it later. So here is what he writes in the introduction to this image atlas. He says, so Warburg was an art historian, right? So this is an art history perspective, but it has a much larger impact or import. He says, if the formation of style, this is the art historian speaking, if the formation of style is understood as a problem of the exchange of expressive values, then we are faced with the imperative of examining the technology of the means of transportation underlying the dynamics of this process. Means of transportation in German is die Technik seiner Verkehrsmittel. The era between Piero della Francesca and the school of Raphael is an epoch of the international migration of images, again Bilderwanderung, between North and South, due not only to its mobility, but also its technique, which fitted the multiple reproduction of the iconic content. The Flemish tapestry is the first, albeit colossal, automobile vehicle for images, which, freed from the wall, served as a forerunner of the printed illustrated page, in other words, the copper engraving and the woodcut, that for the first time made the exchange of expressive values between North and South into a vital part of the process of circulation that shaped the formation of European style. End of quote. So, reading Warburg with an eye to what I called iconomics, a general economy of images that seeks to account for the laws of their circulation and exchanges, we could pay attention not only to the becoming of iconic routes and vehicles in the digital age, but also to the history, to the genealogy which ties them to the road networks that have striated the visible in the past. There are unsuspected continuities between them, but also sharp contrasts, differentials of speed in the propagation of images. Let us take an example that is as simple as it is striking.
Reminders of the past lie buried in the earth, but few of the workers fully understand how this cable will connect their country to the world.
They once used to speak of magic eyes and ears. Have you heard the elders or read the Ramayana? Magic eyes, magic ears. It's this cable. Magic eyes means you're here, but you can see as far as America. You can see the whole world. That's the magic eyes. With this cable, they transmit television. They show CNN to the whole world. All over the world, people watch news on television. That's the magic eye. And the magic ears? You're here, but you hear someone in America or in Canada. Thanks to this network called telecommunications.
I don't have electricity, just an oil lamp. That's all I have. Electricity comes through a wire connected to a generator. I don't have it.
So we watched on YouTube, I took this from YouTube, the fascinating documentary by Cambodian director Ritipan. The title is The Land of the Wandering Souls. It was shot in 2000. Ritipan filmed during 3 months the digging of a trench across Cambodia to lay the first optical fiber cable. Barefoot, using picks, the workers are paid the equivalent of 60 cents per meter, and their families have to beg for food. This is how they laboriously clear the path of what will eventually become a highway of images, speeding from one continent to another. What kinds of speeds are clashing here? From the slow progression of the laying of the cable to the streaming of the documentary that shows it at the other end of the world. In front of 2 incredulous workers, you heard it, an engineer working for the cable company explains, while holding a piece of optical fiber cable in his hand, that this is the equivalent of the magic eyes and magic ears the ancients were talking about. As Ritipan explained in a seminar he gave in an art school in Paris. The digital highway, I'm translating, of the optical fiber cable is grafted upon the historical Silk Road across Cambodia. And as a matter of fact, the new road networks of the visible often follow existing paths inherited from the past. The shifting geopolitics of the iconic roads and vehicles that Abby Warburg outlined is one of the main tasks of what I would call an iconomics to come. Like the images themselves, gazes too follow more or less precisely drawn trajectories. On the various panels of the Mnemosine Atlas, an atlas of images, as I said, that Abby Warburg left unfinished when he died in 1929. On these panels, the juxtaposition of images was a way to prepare the saccades, that is to say, the rapid, intermittent movements of the eyes of the beholders. A good example is this panel, panel 32, dedicated to Carnival, to the iconography of Carnival, where the dancing figures that you can see here on the bottom around the chessboard, they could be the emblem also of the dancing gaze that the panel elicits. Warburg described the Hamburg library that he founded and where he gave lectures illustrated by these mobile panels. He described it as a revolving observation tower, or again, an observation tower that scans the whole migratory routes of culture and symbols between Asia and America. That was his project. So the visual micro-exchanges produced by the movements of the eyes on the panels and between the panels responded or corresponded in a way to the vast migratory circulations within the visible. This is the kind of maps that Warburg also drew. So he was working with these panels and with the interrelations between these panels, and he was also working on these migratory routes. I won't go here into the details of the genealogy of the techniques for mobilizing the gaze. I retraced some of them in the supermarket of the visible, from the first elevators in 17th century France to the movements of the cinematic camera or the use of eye tracking devices for marketing purposes. You can follow one's gaze. Let me rather show you some images of a series of recent installations by French artist Julien Prévieux. But first, here is how he describes his work for an art gallery in Toronto in 2017. I quote, "It was a question of measuring the visitors' act of looking as they viewed the exhibited artworks in the Blackwood Gallery, thanks to the procedure of eye tracking as used by certain marketing departments. To do so, the pupils' movements are recorded by an infrared camera. Software detects the movement and sketches a diagram which allows us to see the eye's journey and focusing area over time, what they call in eye studies saccade and points of fixation. We transferred these lines to the walls of the gallery with spools of wool and hot glue." They are fascinating, these arachnean routes followed by our eyes in a few fractions of seconds. They seem to reproduce, on the reduced scale of our ocular microsaccades, the vast migratory cartographies that Warburg was drawing. It is as if each image gazed at by the beholder became itself the theater of internal migrations. The gaze that circulates between images or inside images, the gaze that comes and goes, that oscillates, that zigzags, scans, and evaluates ceaselessly, what is it that it cannot see? What is it that remains necessarily in the shadow? There are so many things happening between images or fragments of images, thus eliciting what Warburg called an iconology of the interval, Ikonologie des Zwischenraumes, he said. But a lot happens behind the images too, or better, underneath their surface, as I mentioned earlier, underneath the surface of images. It is there, in what we could call the infraperceptual zone of images, in their coded texture or text, that a hidden iconic economy is constantly at work. What exactly is this shadow economy? In order to understand what is at stake, we have to consider how the road networks of the visible determine what I described as the secret writing of the very coming into appearance of images, that is to say their coding, formatting, resolution or definition, and weight. In other words, the speed of their trajectories and the overload, the congestion they could create in the traffic. Compression, as I'm sure many of you know, compression is the technical name for the management, or better still, for the political economy of the becoming visible. Images, as we know, are constantly being rewritten along their migratory routes. They are coded and decoded by what is called a codec in technical language. Codec is a portmanteau for coder-decoder. That is to say, a computer program for encoding or decoding a digital data stream in order to gain space or to gain bandwidth on the road. Jonathan Stern, who's one of the most interesting thinkers on these questions, Jonathan Stern has analyzed some of the perceptual techniques, as he calls them, that are used for this purpose. Portions of the digital description of sounds and images are removed from their coded texture under the assumption that they would not be heard or seen anyway, due to the perceptual gaps that are built into our sensory apparatus. For example, a color zone can be digitized by leaving out the micro contrasts it contains and which the eye doesn't notice. In the case of moving images, the encoding can skip what remains similar between the successive images in a sequence and retain only what changes from one image to the next, so that you can compress the image and gain space. In this way, compression creates what Jonathan Stern names a surplus definition, which is a notion that he clearly models on Marx's surplus value. He says, I quote, "I will use the term surplus definition to describe the difference between the definition in the sense of resolution, right? Between the definition that a media system can theoretically produce and what its users need to perceive in order for it to work, so long as this difference is put to use." So this is iconomy at work. Now, what is surplus definition if not, once again, a differential of speeds? It is as if the image were traveling faster than it could do without compression, as if it were gaining space and hence time and speed, thus overtaking itself, overtaking other possible versions of itself on the road networks of the visible. The image we see is the stabilized or coagulated result of a whole series of iconomic transactions that negotiate its accelerations and decelerations, its compressed coding and decoding. Of course, when the circulation of iconic data runs into traffic jams on the road networks of the visible, one can see it. The image becomes pixelated, as when we watch Ritipan's Land of the Wandering Soul on YouTube. But what we cannot see as such are the speed differentials that result in pixelation. Indeed, borrowing from Freud and from Benjamin, one could conceive of pixelation as a precarious balance of forces, as a compromise formation produced by the optical unconscious, or better still, by the optical unperceived. Now, where is this shadowy, imperceptual iconomy leading us? The hypothesis I would like to put forward is the following. Any image could be conceived of as a differential of speeds that has been temporarily stabilized or balanced. Or conversely, the energetics of the image, as it demands to be thought in the age of its general exchangeability, could well be the generalization of an iconomy inherent to the image as such. I will try to develop this argument. In order to put this hypothesis to the test, let us take a big step back, a jump or a leap indeed, not unlike those made by the protagonist of an extraordinary narrative that I would like to read to reach the end of this talk. Adalbert von Chamisso's Peter Schlemihl, a German story narrative from the early 19th century, the protagonist of which puts on his 7-leagued boots, as we will see. So I will briefly follow this narrative in order to try to argue this point that that is to say, it's a sort of historical hypothesis, but a retrospective hypothesis. If we consider what happens to images today, that is to say, if we consider that the image in the era of its general exchangeability has to be thought of as a differential of speed, the question arises if this has not been always the case. And that's what I would like to explore. But let us take a short run-up and before reading closely a few passages from Peter Schlemihl, and let us revisit what is generally considered as the myth of the origin of painting or the painted image. There are many representations of the ancient scene we are about to witness. One of them, kept at the Château de Versailles, is Jean-Baptiste Regnault's Débutade ou l'origine de la peinture, 1786. So this is about the practice of what was called in Greek skiagraphia, literally the writing of shadow. And this skiagraphia is already mentioned as a familiar pictorial technique in Plato and Aristotle, for example, where it is a metaphor for illusion. In Book 10 of Plato's Republic, 602d, Socrates says that skiagraphy pertains to witchcraft. And in Book 5 of Aristotle's Metaphysics, skiagraphy shares the unreal nature of things seen in dreams. Later, skiagraphy plays an important role in legendary accounts of the invention of painting, as in Pliny's Natural History, Book 35:15, I quote, "The question as to the origin of the art of painting is uncertain, and it doesn't belong to the plan of this work, but all agree that it began with tracing an outline round a man's shadow." End of quote. So the invention of painting is said to coincide with the circumscribing of shadows, with their contouring. But in another passage later in the same book, Book 35, Pliny locates this origin that he previously set aside. He says it doesn't belong to his planned discourse. He locates it in a pictorial gesture that is immediately translated in another medium. Drawing, as you will see, becomes a relief in clay. As if, this is the important thing here, as if the beginnings of painting were only thinkable for him through a shift that substitutes the first picture ever. This is the legendary account of the birth of painted pictures. A shift that substitutes the first picture ever by another version or another format of itself. Right? Painting becomes a relief in clay. So I quote Pliny again. Modeling portraits from clay was first invented by Butades, a potter of Sicyon at Corinth. He did this owing to his daughter, who was in love with a young man, and she, when he was going abroad, drew in outline on the wall the shadow of his face thrown by a lamp. Her father pressed clay on this and made a relief, which he hardened by exposure to fire with the rest of his pottery. End of quote. Now, if we follow this account of the origin of pictures traced by man, it has to be said then that their coming into existence is indissociable from an exchange or a swapping of mediums or of formats. The origin of painting would be a reformatting from drawing to relief, indeed a differential of speeds. One of the formats takes more time than the other, a difference that is bound to disappear precisely as a differential in its very coming into appearance. Even if it is hence tempting to read into the invention of painting as recounted by Pliny an already iconomic dimension, the least we can say is that it remains implicit. Indeed, one has to wait for the fantastic novella I alluded to, and that we will now read a little bit. The fantastic novella published by Adalbert von Camisso in 1814, translated in English as The Wonderful History of Peter Schlemihl. We have to wait for this novella to bring to the fore, to unfold the implied shadow economy that haunts pictoriality since its legendary Greek beginnings. So what happens to the eponymous character, to Peter Schlemihl? Lured by a meager and elderly man dressed in a grey coat, he agrees to a bargain, to a sort of Faustian contract. I quote, "I give you my shadow for your purse." Unfortunately, I can't go into all the fascinating details of this remarkable story here, so let me emphasize one motif that seems of particular relevance for our purpose: the oscillation of the shadow between materiality and immateriality. Let us read, for example, what appears in chapter 3 as a fantastic retelling of Pliny's account of the beginnings of painting. I quote, "To leave nothing untried, I sent Bendel," Bendel is Peter Schlegelmilch's servant, "with a costly, brilliant ring to the most celebrated painter in the city, requesting he would pay me a visit. 'Mr. Professor,' I began, 'can you paint a false shadow for one who, in the most luckless way in the world, has lost his own? Last winter, when he was,'" so Schlegelmilch is speaking about himself in the third person to remain, so to speak, anonymous, because it's a shame to lose one's shadow. "Last winter, when he," that is to say I, "was traveling in Russia, it froze so severely during the extraordinary cold that his shadow was frozen to the ground, and it was impossible for him to get it free. And I," said the professor, the painter, "could only make him a sheet shadow, which he would be apt to lose again." End of quote. Were we to take this extraordinary narrative literally, we could find here the outlines of a theory of shadows considered as energy and speed. If shadows, according to the Plinian account of the origin of painting, are the components of the image that can be formed only by being immediately reformatted, they are also, in this late and fantastic rewriting of the same scene, they are what can be made to crystallize, to freeze, as a prosthetic remainder. Shadows, at the time when Camiso rewrites Pliny, have become, as Warburg would put it, the automobile vehicle for images par excellence. Silhouettes, Schattenbilder in German, literally shadow images, that is to say portraits in profile, cut with scissors out of black paper, were as popular as photography would eventually become. Various apparatuses or machines were designed in order to produce them, modeled on the physiognotrace invented by a certain Gilles-Louis Chrétien in 1783. In sum, shadows became the object of what would later be described as a media industry. They were mechanized and formatted in order to circulate all the better, since they were compressed, so to speak. They only represented contours. Indeed, one is almost tempted to say that Peter Schlegelmilch's frozen shadow seems to anticipate what Marshall McLuhan, much later, in 1964, will call cool media, that is to say, media characterized by a low definition. McLuhan's introduction of a caloric paradigm, so to speak, in media theory seems bound to acquire a new relevance today, actually, when the overheating caused by high-definition streaming consumes a lot of energy for cooling purposes. Now, Peter Schlegelmilch's shadow can become solid, stuck or glued to the surface it is projected upon, but it can also be lost. It is volatile, it is poorly attached. Almost like a prosthetic limb, it can be lent. Bendel, the servant at a certain point in the narrative, generously offers to lend his shadow to Peter Schlegelmilch. And the shadow can even be chased, as when Peter Schlegelmilch, in an extraordinary scene, encounters, be careful, the visible shadow of an invisible man, and mistakes it for his. I quote, There passed by on the sunny sand a man's shadow not unlike my own, wandering about alone, and which appeared straying from its owner. I imagined that if I were lucky enough to get into its track, I could so arrange that its feet should just meet mine. It would even attach and accommodate itself to me. Let us take a closer look at the engraving imagined by the British illustrator George Cruikshank for this passage in 1824 for the English translation. The image of the main character, who is himself an image, the image of the main character who runs after his shadow, after his image, is the most grasping figuration of the speed differential that every image is. It is quite literally that the image here anticipates itself or lags behind itself. It is literally a speed differential. The endless swaps or appropriations that the shadow experiences are summed up in what amounts to Camusot's iconomic formula par excellence, when the devilish grey man addresses Peter Schlemihl with the following words: "You have my gold, and I have your shadow. They leave no rest to either of us. They leave no tranquility." So this restlessness soon turns into the ceaseless motion of Peter Schlemihl, of the one who ends up getting used to his shadowless condition, only when fortune gives him a pair of 7-leagued boots that I alluded to earlier. His shadowlessness then becomes indissolubly linked to the utter speed with which he crisscrosses the earth, like a picture circulating breathlessly through the cables of our contemporary economic space. I quote, "I passed into Europe by the pillars of Hercules," that is to say the Strait of Gibraltar, "and after I had taken a rapid survey of its southern and northern provinces, I hastened to North Asia and thence over the polar glaciers to Greenland and America." End of quote. I would like to conclude this talk on the image in the age of its globalized exchangeability by casting a retrospective glance upon Walter Benjamin's essay on the work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility, the model or shadow of which was constantly haunting my discourse, as if it were the hidden code buried under the surface of my words. When Benjamin gives one of his famously enigmatic characterization of the aura, of the singularity, or even the sacrality of the unique in the work of art, he reverses, in a way, the legend of Butades and his daughter as told by Pliny. For he describes the aura as the shadow cast on the beholder. I quote, "What then is the aura?" It's a very famous passage. I'm almost ashamed of quoting it. "What then is the aura? To follow with the eye, while resting on a summer afternoon, a mountain range on the horizon, or a branch that casts its shadow on the beholder, is to breathe the aura of these mountains, of that branch." What Benjamin calls the aura's present decay, then, is a Schlemihlian loss of shadow. The non-auratic images that lead their autonomous life on our social networks can depict shadows, as we all know. There are many images of shadows. They can show or represent shadows, but they apparently have no shadows themselves. They don't seem to cast shadows. Indeed, the more images tend towards what we fantasize as an immaterial state, the less shadows they have. Compare a sculpture and a JPEG file. And yet, one could say that their digital text or texture, woven as it is with imperceptual investments and bearing the fingerprints of so many hands clicking in the dark, is our contemporary skiography. This image, by the way, is a photograph I took of an amazing installation by a Japanese artist, Kumi Yamashita, which is on display at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. So, to conclude, this shadow economy that corresponds to today's road networks of the visible is where the coming into appearance of the image is negotiated constantly as a differential of speeds. Thank you very much.